My brother scoffed at my minimum wage job. Years later, he begged me after losing everything. The chill snaked up my spine as I stared at the screen. That name, his name, after all this time, after everything that had happened, it was like a ghost rising from the ashes of our past. He needed something, and the bitter truth of it, I already knew what it was. I remember when you said I'd always be a nobody. His face was a mask of disbelief, the color draining from his skin as the weight of karma's arrival crashed down on him. And the craziest part, I don't think I ever truly hated my brother growing up. Hate is such a venomous word, and when you share the same blood, the same childhood, under the same roof, it complicates things, right? It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment things went sideways between us, Mason and I. Maybe there wasn't a single moment. Maybe it was always destined to be this way. We were raised in the same house, by the same parents, but we might as well have been from different planets, orbiting entirely different stars. I was the responsible one, the one who always did what was expected. Mason, he was the golden child, the shining star, the one who could seemingly do no wrong. I used to think I was imagining it, that I was just being sensitive. But as we grew older, it became harder and harder to ignore. Mason was the kind of guy who could fail a test, shrug it off with a dazzling smile, and still get a pat on the back. You're smart, you'll figure it out, they'd say. What about me? What happened when I faltered? When I was 15, I got my first job working at a small diner, mostly washing dishes at first, but eventually taking orders, and they were sure stuff. The pay was absolutely terrible, but I loved the feeling of earning my own money, knowing that every dollar I made was mine, and through my own sweat. Of course, Mason never had to work a day in his life. When I'd come home late, smelling like grease and stale coffee, he'd be stretched out on the couch, glued to a video game, completely unfazed by the concept of responsibility. I remember him asking me once, laughing as I peeled off my work uniform, still slinging hash, how I like making money. I retorted, trying to ignore the sting. He just smirked. Yeah, well, I'd rather not waste my time flipping burgers for minimum wage. But hey, if that's your thing, it wasn't just the words themselves. It was how he said it, like my entire existence was something to be pitied, like the fact that I was working was a joke he was too polite to laugh at out loud. I ignored him, or at least I tried to, but the words stuck with me, festering like a splinter under my skin. Our parents never pressured him to get a job. He had a ludicrous allowance well into his late teens, money for new clothes, new shoes, concert tickets, whatever he wanted. I, on the other hand, had to meticulously budget my tips just to be able to take a girl to the movies. Mason's just different, my mom would say, with that familiar side. He's not as responsible as you, but that's why we count on you to be the mature one. That was always the mantra. Years passed, and we took distinctly different paths. I worked my way through college, swallowing my pride and taking out loans where I had to. I got my degree in accounting, landed a decent job at a firm, and started building a life. Not flashy, but solid, steady. Mason, he dropped out of college after 2 years, decided it wasn't for him. He didn't have to worry. Dad pulled some strings and got him a job at a real estate firm through a friend. Suddenly, he was making 6 figures, driving a brand new car, living in a luxury apartment downtown. At every family gathering, he'd make sure to ask, with that condescending tone, still grinding away at that 9 to -5. Huh? I don't know how you do it. I'd go crazy if I had to sit at a desk all day. I learned to plaster, smile on my face, and force myself to smile through the lingering resentment. The feeling that, no matter how hard I worked, no matter what I achieved, Mason would always be perceived as more. Then, life happened, and everything changed. It started small, whispers at family gatherings, when Mason wasn't in the room. Mom and Dad looking at each other with worried eyes. Then came the phone calls. Mason's investments weren't doing so well. The real estate market had taken a nosedive. Suddenly, the golden child wasn't so golden anymore. At first, he laughed it off, just a rough patch, he'd say, with a forced grin. Happens to everyone. But the market continued to crash, taking his confidence and his money with it. The company he worked for fired him to avoid the legal fallout of some seriously shady lawsuits that started piling up. The luxury apartment was gone. The expensive car, repossessed. Mom and Dad tried to help, of course, but they were struggling themselves. Dad had been diagnosed with a heart condition, and the medical bills were piling up. Mason's problems were no longer their sole priority. And then, one evening, my phone rang. I knew, deep down, that this call was inevitable. Hey, it's Mason. His voice was strained, quieter than I'd ever heard it before, like he was suddenly, painfully aware of how small he'd become. I need a favor. I closed my eyes, bracing myself. How much? There was a long, drawn-out pause. A loan, just something to get me back on my feet. He said it like it was his birthright, something owed to him. I let the silence drag out just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then, finally, I spoke. Do you remember when we were kids? He didn't answer. Do you remember when you used to laugh at me for working at the diner? Still nothing. Do you remember telling me I'd be 50 and still flipping patties? There was a sharp intake of breath, a hesitation. Come on, Mal. I was a kid. You were a kid at 25. When you looked me in the eye and told me I was wasting my life. I interrupted, my voice hardening. The silence after that statement was deafening. His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Please. And for the first time in my life, I felt power. Not the kind that comes from wealth or status, but a deep, visceral power. For so long, I had swallowed my pride, had let him sneer at me, look down on me, dismiss me like I was nothing. And now, I savored the moment. You know, Mason, I could help you. More silence. But I won't. I continued, my voice flat. Because I am what I have, I said. And you never respected hard work. You never respected me. And now you want my money. I let out a quiet chuckle, devoid of humor. Not happening. Good luck, Mason. And then I hung up. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the lesser brother. And it was a relief. I sat there for a long time, just staring at my phone pressed against my chest. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt like a door had finally been shut and locked. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't standing on the outside, looking in. He wasn't the type to give up after one try. Over the next few days, I saw his name pop up on my screen more times than I could count. I ignored every call, deleted every voicemail. Then my mom joined the fray, her voice already carrying that tired, pleading tone I'd come to expect whenever Mason was involved. Mal, can you just talk to your brother? Talk to him, Mom, I said. I said no, he's made mistakes. Mal, yes, but he's your brother. Family helps family. That's funny, I said, unable to stop the bitter sarcasm from creeping into my voice. I don't remember him ever helping me. There was a pause, and then, softer. You were always the strong one. There it was, the same excuse I had heard my whole life. The reason Mason got away with everything. That's not true. I exhaled sharply. Mom, I love you, but I'm not fixing his problems. Not this time. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, he's staying with us. I froze. What? Just until he gets back on his feet. He had nowhere else to go. And you let him move back home? I asked before I could stop myself. A quiet firmness in her voice. I let out a humorless laugh. Number, you enabled him. There's a difference. You don't understand. I'm his mother. Mao, she said, her voice laced with sadness. Of course, I do. But he was ruined. I know you thought he was just broke. I rubbed my temples, exhaustion settling deep into my bones. He's your problem now, not mine. And with that, I ended the call. Days turned into weeks. I didn't reach out. I buried myself in work, throwing myself into my life. I tried not to think about Mason wasting away in our parents' house, sulking in the same bedroom he'd occupied since he was a kid. But life has a funny way of pulling you back in, no matter how much you try to walk away. One evening, as I was leaving work, I saw an unfamiliar car parked outside my office. And there he was, leaning against the hood, arms crossed, looking like a shadow of the brother I once knew. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by an ill-fitting hoodie and a defeated expression. He looked vulnerable, almost. I walked towards him without a word. Mao, he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. Just hear me out. I sighed and finally faced him. Why are you here? He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. I don't have anyone else. And whose fault is that? I retorted, turning to head back to the definition of our parents' house. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. For now, what does that mean? Mason hesitated, avoiding my gaze, his hand rubbing the back of his neck, looking anywhere but at me. They took out a loan. What? For me? He admitted, his voice barely audible. I told them it would be temporary, that I just needed a little help, but I haven't been able to pay it back. And now they're struggling. I took a step closer, my jaw clenching. You let them go into debt for you? He flinched. I didn't let them. I didn't ask. I didn't think it would get this bad. He was shaking his head. I stared at him, the anger in my chest slowly being overtaken by something colder, something more dangerous. Mason wasn't just some arrogant kid who made bad choices. He wasn't just a spoiled golden child who had finally hit rock bottom. He was a sinking ship, and he was dragging everyone down with him. You need to fix this, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. How am I supposed to do that now? I can't even get a job at a gas station. No one wants to hire a guy with my record. Exactly, I said, my words sharp as shards of glass. Mao, Mason exhaled, looking down at his worn shoes. I just thought maybe we could start over. Maybe if I could prove to you that I'm trying. I shook my head. No, Mason, we don't get to start over just because it's convenient for you now. For a moment, it looked like he wanted to fight, to lash out, but he didn't. Instead, he just nodded, defeated. He started to leave, his shoulder gripping the handle like it was the only thing keeping him up. For a second, I thought about stopping him, about saying something, anything, but I didn't. I just watched as he got into the car and drove away. And for the first time, I wondered if I would ever see him again. I didn't sleep well that night, even though I had done what I knew was right. Even though I had stood my ground, I couldn't shake the unease pressing against my chest. I told myself he had blown so many golden opportunities, and he had thrown them all away. Did people like me, people who worked hard, people who saved, people who weren't handed things on a silver platter, never stood up for the man standing in front of me, the one looking like a shadow of his former self? I shouldn't worry, but because of our parents, they were comfortable enough and had me to fall back on. But with Dad's health problems, he wasn't his usual self, and Mason had dragged them into the hole. I was angry with him, not because they didn't want to enable Mason any more than I already was. And maybe that's what made me so angry. They knew who he was. They had seen what he had done time and time again, and they still felt the need to protect him. That next morning, I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about my parents' loan, about how much trouble they were really in. I knew I wouldn't get a straight answer from Mason, so there was only one thing left to do. I drove to their house. When I pulled into the driveway, even when I was a kid and resented being the one expected to be mature, I swallowed my bitterness and went inside. I knocked, and my mother answered the door. "Mao, you didn't tell me you were coming. What can I do for you?" "I knew if I did, you'd have found a reason for me not to," she said and stepped aside, letting me in. Dad was in the recliner, flipping through a newspaper, but when he saw me, he set it down on the side table. I sat on the couch, getting straight to the point. "How much is the loan?" "Mao," Harper replied this time. She glanced at my father and twisted the ring. "I stopped you from telling our son. Just tell me the truth. Stop with the lie. I know he's not paying it back. I need to know how much." Mom rubbed her hands together. This made my hands curl into fists. "What else?" Dad let out a long breath. It was supposed to be temporary. Just something. I felt my heart rate pick up. "How much?" He hesitates, looking from me back to Harper. "Almost $40,000. I closed my eyes. I didn't know what made me angrier. The fact that Mason had let them do it, or the fact that my parents had actually offered. "Dad," I said, my voice drooping with disbelief as I pulled the fence, the rage boiling beneath. I leaned forward. We thought he'd turn it around. He just needed a little help. He's been given help his entire life, and look where that's gotten him. How could you to not see? Mom whispered softly, "He's our son, Mao," rubbing a hand down my face. I replied, "I'll fix this." I muttered, "I know you didn't tell me." Update, I didn't ask, but it doesn't change the fact that this is a mess that needs to be dealt with. And I can help you get Daddy's money back and cover everything that Mason screwed up. Dad sighed. "And how exactly do you plan to fix this mess?" I didn't answer right away because I didn't know, but there was one thing I did know. Mason was going to pay, one way or another. As a sign of good faith, I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Mason had drained my parents and paid for his new lifestyle, paid for Dad's medical bills and groceries. Have they taken on more debt just to stay afloat? Have they cut back on things they needed so Mason could continue living off them like a parasite? And the worst part, I could see it in my mother's eyes. She knew that Mason had screwed up and had done something awful, but was still loving him anyway. And my dad, normally so rigid and practical, had let this happen and had allowed Mason to sink them. They would never turn their backs on Mason, no matter how much it cost them, but I would. I parked in front of my house and sat in my car for a long time, staring at nothing. My heart was still racing, and I had savings to cover what they had lost. I had a steady job, making even if I pulled from my own retirement, I still wouldn't be able to fully clean up the mess Mason had made. And why should I? Why should I have to fix something he did? Because if I didn't, I ran a hand down my face, trying to calm myself. But Mason wasn't just a lost cause. He wasn't just our brother. He was dangerous. I needed to confront him. I needed him to understand that this was it, that he had burned his last bridge, that there was no more free pass, that he had to finally face the consequences of his own actions. But it was hard to know exactly where to find him after he left our parents' home. It wasn't hard to track Mason down. He had been bouncing between cheap motels, crashing with old friends until they inevitably realized he had nothing to offer. Mason was lost. I wanted to visit him, and I looked at the house, smaller, and I remembered. Maybe because I had spent so many years something that didn't feel so trapped. But there it was, the porch light flickering slightly, the old oak tree swaying in the breeze, the faint glow of the living room lamp, barely visible through the curtain. I stepped out of my car, my jaw tight as I made my way up the front steps. The second I opened the door, I saw him. Mason was sitting on the couch, one leg stretched out lazily. He had a beer in one hand and the TV remote in the other. The picture of someone who shouldn't have been so relaxed given the circumstances. But he wasn't just relaxed. He was comfortable, like he belonged there. Like he hadn't just ruined it to people who had spent their entire lives taking care of him. I felt something in my chest surge, a black void opening in my heart, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to mild annoyance. "You really shouldn't just barge in like that," he said, setting the beer down on the coffee table. I ignored him. "Where is Mom?" "At the store, and Dad is asleep, of course," He was always asleep these days, too tired to deal with any of this. Just too tired. This made me turn red with anger and rage as he watched TV, living in his house without a single thought. I took a slow step forward. What happened with the loan? I said quietly. Mason frowned. What about it? I clenched my fists. You told me they took out a loan. You didn't tell me they drained their retirement. Oh, I didn't want you to freak out. I snapped and told him to shut up. I had never spoken to him like that. Never let my voice drop into something so cold, so dangerous. I'm not playing this game anymore, I said. Are you done using them? He was shaking his head, so I replied with, and what do you want me to do? Mao, get a job working at a gas station. You think anyone's going to hire me after everything that's happened? Yes, I said flatly, because that's what people do. They figure it out. They don't just leech off the people who love them until there's nothing left. I didn't ask them to give me that money. I know, I just wasn't going to say no. Silence stretched between us. Then finally, Mason sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. But what do you want me to do? Walk out the door with nothing? Sleep in my car? Yes, I said again. That's exactly what I want, and I'm not going to let you ruin them. The way you ruined yourself. So you have the choices. For a split second, I saw something behind his eyes, a flash of the Mason I'd grown up with. The Mason who had never once in his life believed that he would ever face real consequences. You're serious? Deadly serious. I stared at him for a long time. Then, finally, he let out a breath, stood up, and nodded. Okay, he said quietly. I hadn't expected it to be that easy. I had expected a fight, one last attempt at manipulation. But instead, Mason just turned and started to walk to the stairs to Pat. I want you to leave and never come back. I stood there and watched him, and I felt an emptiness that did not leave. He was packing a few belongings and put something in my gut that told me that this wasn't over. That he was the kind of person who always found a way to twist a situation, to manipulate people, to get back on top even when there was no ground left to stand on. So I waited. I heard his footsteps upstairs, the slow opening and closing of drawers, the shifting of a duffel bag. I heard something else, the sound of my mother's voice, soft and concerned. I saw her walking up the driveway, grocery bags in her hands. I clenched my jaw because even now, he was still trying to find a way to stay, and I wasn't going to let him. I walked to the front door and stepped outside just as my mother was reaching for the handle. She said, startled, Mao, what are you doing here? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I glanced down at the phone in her hand. She sighed, shaking her head. He told me you were kicking him out. He's not supposed to be here. He has nowhere else to go, she whispered. That's not my problem, Mom. My voice was firm and strong. Mom, I can't keep doing this. You are throwing away everything I've worked for. And just because Mason doesn't know how to live without you and Dad. The guilt and love are too much. She swallowed hard. We'll figure it out. I exhaled sharply. You shouldn't have to figure it out, I said. And with this she understood. He is my son, I reminded her. She closed her eyes. For a moment, the pain and exhaustion covered her face. I wasn't sure, and she finally nodded. And that was it. Mason had lost his last chance. Just as Mason was coming down the stairs, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, the realization that, for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to hold on to. No more second chances. I could hear footsteps on the stairs, and saw Mason appear, and saw him in his hand holding a duffel bag. Mom, he started, and she turned away, walked into the kitchen, and started putting away the groceries. Mason's lips parted slightly in disbelief. He turned to me. His eyes looked like a twisted whirlwind. And he looked at me again, and I saw it. The anger, the resentment, the disbelief that I had done this to him, that I had finally cut him off completely. But he didn't say a word. He just walked out the door, and he never came back. The months that followed were quiet. For the first time in years, there were no endless disasters to clean up. And I helped, not by throwing money at their problems the way they had done for Mason, but by giving them the tools to fix things themselves. I went over their finances, showed them how to regain control of their spending, and helped them with their day-to-day. It took time, but they recovered. I heard bits and pieces of news about Mason now and again. A friend of a friend saw him working at a rundown car lot on the other side of town, barely scraping by. Someone else mentioned he was living in a small rented room, taking odd jobs wherever he could. He never reached out, and I never did. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just resigned. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally learning the value of hard work. So, there you have it. Reddit, the whole messy, complicated story. Considering everything, the years of being belittled, the financial strain he put on my parents, the way he almost ruined their lives. Do you think I handled the situation with Mason correctly? Was I justified in cutting him off the way I did? Or should I have tried to help him? Despite everything, I'm honestly still wrestling with it. And I'd really appreciate your honest opinions and insights. Let me know your thoughts. I'm curious to hear what you all think. I have been struggling with these decisions. I want to know the opinions of others who would give me good, honest, and respectable feedback.